From a recovery bed, 40 minutes after waking up from a 6-hour spinal surgery, I texted the family group chat and asked one simple question. Could anyone come get me?
My son-in-law, Peter, answered first. Traffic's brutal right now. Grab a cab. It's easier for everyone. My daughter didn't say anything at all. Not a word, not even a heart emoji. Just silence. The kind that tells you more than a sentence ever could. I sat there in a paper gown with a fresh incision running down my spine, staring at that message. And something in me went very quiet and very still. Not sad. Still. The kind of stillness that comes right before a decision you've been circling for months finally lands. I called a cab myself. And on the ride home, I made one phone call that Peter had absolutely no idea was coming, because 2 months earlier, without telling a single person in my family, I'd already begun quietly making sure that if this exact moment ever arrived, I wouldn't be walking back into a business that still belonged to people who couldn't be bothered to drive 40 minutes to pick up an old man from a hospital. My name is Harold. I'm 68, and for 36 years I ran a mid-sized commercial construction firm here in Ohio, the kind of company that builds strip malls, warehouses, the unglamorous backbone of every town nobody thinks about until the roof leaks. I started it with a used pickup truck and a business loan my late wife, Joan, co-signed against her better judgment, back when we were young enough to believe risk was romantic instead of terrifying. Joan passed 9 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, the kind of diagnosis that rearranges your entire relationship with time. After she was gone, our daughter, Ellen, became the center of what family I had left. Ellen married Peter about 7 years ago. A smart, ambitious man, the kind who talks in 5-year plans and always seems to be looking slightly past whoever he's talking to, toward whatever's next. I brought him into the business almost immediately, first as a project coordinator, then over the years as someone I trusted with increasingly serious responsibility. I want to be fair to myself here, because hindsight makes fools of all of us in hindsight. I didn't hand Peter anything. He earned real trust, incrementally, the way people do when you're watching closely. He was sharp with contracts, good with subcontractors, the kind of person who could walk a job site and immediately spot the one detail that would blow the budget 6 weeks later. By his 3rd year, I'd made him a minority partner, 15% of the company, formalized, notarized, the whole thing. What I didn't fully understand until much later was that 15% to a man like Peter was never going to feel like enough. Not because he was owed more, because ambition, in certain people, isn't a fixed appetite. It's a hole that gets bigger the more you feed it. The shift didn't happen with any single dramatic moment. It happened the way most betrayals happen inside families. Through 100 small recalibrations, each one defensible on its own, each one part of a pattern only visible from a distance. It started, as these things often do, with meetings I stopped being invited to. Peter began scheduling calls with our biggest clients, a regional grocery chain, a hospital system expanding 2 new outpatient wings, and framing them to me afterward as just a quick touch base. Didn't want to waste your time on the small stuff. Except the small stuff kept growing. Within a year, clients who used to call me directly were calling Peter first, because Peter had made himself endlessly available in a way that, to them, read as competence, and to me, increasingly read as a slow, deliberate rerouting of relationships I'd spent decades building. Then came the subcontractor renegotiations. Peter started restructuring our vendor agreements, quietly locking in longer-term contracts under his own name as the primary point of contact rather than the company's. When I asked about it, he had a smooth answer, ready. Something about liability distribution, about protecting the company from a single point of failure. It sounded reasonable. Almost everything Peter said sounded reasonable. That was, I'd eventually understand, exactly the danger of him. The real turning point came about 8 months before my surgery. Peter proposed, at what was supposed to be a routine quarterly meeting, that the company formally restructure its ownership to reflect what he called operational reality, specifically bumping his stake from 15% to 40%, on the grounds that he was now handling the majority of day-to-day client relationships and deserved equity that matched his actual workload. I said no, firmly. I told him equity isn't handed out because someone's made themselves the loudest voice in the room. It's earned through the kind of risk I'd carried for 36 years, the mortgaged house in 1994. The year we almost lost everything to a client who declared bankruptcy owing us $400,000. Peter had never once carried that kind of risk. He'd inherited a stable company and made himself indispensable inside it, which is a very different thing from building one. He didn't argue, he just nodded, said he understood, and something in his expression closed off in a way I noticed, but didn't fully register the significance of at the time. I've thought about that look many times since. It wasn't disappointment. It was recalculation. Here's the thing about being underestimated because you're older. People assume slower reflexes mean a slower mind. I've built a career reading contracts for the sentence buried on page 14 that changes everything on page 1. I don't miss things. I just don't always react to them immediately, which people mistake for not noticing at all. Over the following months, I started paying closer attention to details I'd previously let slide as normal operational noise. Our company's general liability insurance renewal came through with Peter listed as the primary named insured on several new equipment leases. Not illegal, not even unusual on its face, but a quiet accumulation of Peter's name appearing in more and more places where mine used to be the only one that mattered. I also noticed that Ellen, my own daughter, had grown steadily more distant over that same period. Not hostile, just quieter, more deferential to Peter in ways that felt less like marital harmony and more like she'd learned, somewhere along the way, that disagreeing with him cost more than it was worth. I want to be careful here because I never want to speak for my daughter's marriage in a way that isn't mine to speak for. But I noticed. A father notices when his daughter starts checking her husband's expression before she finishes her own sentences. I have to ask you something because I think it sits at the center of every story like this one. Have you ever watched someone position themselves so gradually, so reasonably, that by the time you understand what's actually happening, objecting to any single piece of it makes you sound paranoid rather than perceptive? That's the particular trap of a slow betrayal. There's no single moment to point to, just an accumulation and a growing quiet certainty that something underneath the surface has already shifted. So roughly 2 months before my scheduled spinal surgery, a serious but planned procedure, not an emergency, which meant I had time to think clearly rather than react in a crisis, I did something I'd never done in 36 years of running that company. I called my attorney and asked him quietly, without telling Peter or Ellen, to review every single document Peter had signed on the company's behalf over the past 3 years My attorney, a careful, unglamorous man named Walter Higgs, who'd handled my contracts for over 2 decades, called me back 9 days later with a face. Even over the phone, I could hear it. That told me the news wasn't going to be simple. Peter had not, technically, broken any laws. I want to be precise about that because I think it matters for understanding the shape of what he'd actually done. He hadn't embezzled anything. He hadn't forged a single signature. What he'd done was quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling. He'd spent 3 years systematically restructuring the company's operational relationships. Vendor contracts, client points of contact, even our primary business bank accounts authorized signers, so that his name sat at the center of nearly every functional relationship the company depended on, while mine remained, on paper, the majority owner, in name only. If I'd had a sudden medical emergency, a stroke, a heart attack, anything that incapacitated me without warning, the company would have kept running almost seamlessly under Peter's operational control, while I, still the majority shareholder, would have been functionally locked out of every relationship that actually made the business work. It wasn't theft. It was something closer to a slow-motion coup, built entirely out of legally defensible paperwork. Walter asked me the obvious question. Did I want to confront Peter directly, immediately, and unwind the arrangements before my surgery? I told him no. If I confronted Peter, it would become a fight. Ellen caught in the middle. The surgery delayed by stress I couldn't afford, and Peter, forewarned, simply finding subtler ways to entrench himself further while I was recovering and vulnerable. I needed something more permanent than an argument. I needed the actual structural ground to shift back under my own feet, quietly, before he ever knew it had happened. So I asked Walter to draft something specific. A formal operating agreement amendment requiring that any transfer, delegation, or restructuring of client and vendor relationships above a certain dollar threshold required my explicit, written, notarized authorization. Not verbal approval, not an email, a physical signature witnessed by counsel. It wasn't punitive. It was simply closing a door that had been left quietly open for 3 years. I also did something Peter never saw coming, because he never imagined I'd think of it. I called our longtime office manager, Denise, who'd worked for me for 22 years, long before Peter ever set foot in the building, and asked her to quietly change the administrative access codes on our building's security system and our primary email server. Not to lock Peter out entirely, which would have raised immediate alarm, but to ensure that any changes to those systems required dual authorization between the two of us going forward. Small, boring, unremarkable infrastructure. The kind of thing nobody thinks to fight over until they discover they need it. All of this was finalized 6 days before my surgery. Peter never knew. The surgery itself went smoothly. A 6-hour spinal fusion, more serious than routine, but not the kind of procedure that typically brings a man's family sprinting to a waiting room. Or so I told myself when I woke up in recovery to an empty chair. I asked the nurse, once the anesthesia fog thinned enough to speak clearly, whether anyone had called to check on my status. She told me gently that no one had. I picked up my phone with hands still clumsy from sedation and typed the message to the family group chat. Surgery went well. They're discharging me a bit early. Can someone swing by? Peter's reply came within 4 minutes. Traffic's brutal right now. Grab a cab, it's easier for everyone. Ellen never responded at all, I stared at that silence longer than I stared at Peter's actual words, because I think some part of me had always known Peter's ambition would eventually show its true shape. But I hadn't fully let myself accept how far my daughter had drifted alongside him. I didn't reply. I didn't argue. I called a taxi from the hospital's front entrance, and during the 40-minute ride home, I made the one phone call I'd been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. Not out of premeditated cruelty, but because some quiet, practical part of me had understood, months earlier, that a day like this one was probably coming. And I'd wanted to be ready for it rather than shattered by it. I called Denise. I told her it was time to formally activate the dual authorization protocols we'd quietly put in place, and I asked her to schedule an all-staff and vendor notification for the following Monday morning, informing everyone that, per updated corporate governance, all client and vendor communications going forward required confirmation from my office directly, effective immediately. I want to walk you through what happened Monday morning slowly because I think the quiet mechanics of it matter more than any dramatic confrontation could have. Peter arrived at the office at his usual time, 7:15, coffee in hand, completely unaware that anything had shifted. Denise had already sent the notification to our full vendor list and client roster over the weekend, worded carefully, professionally, without a hint of drama. Simply informing everyone that, effective immediately, all contract modifications and communications required dual sign-off from ownership. Boring. Bureaucratic. The kind of email nobody reads twice, except that its practical effect was to quietly cut Peter's unilateral authority out of every relationship he'd spent 3 years consolidating under his own name. By 9 a.m., Peter had received 4 separate calls from confused vendors asking why their usual point of contact suddenly required additional sign-off. By 10, he'd stormed into my office. My actual office, which I was, in fact, sitting in that morning, my back still healing, moving carefully but present, which I don't think he expected given how badly he'd assumed the surgery would sideline me. "What is this?" he said, holding up a printout of Denise's email, his voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "You're locking me out of my own accounts." "They were never your accounts, Peter," I told him, keeping my voice level, the same tone I'd use closing a difficult contract negotiation. "They were the company's accounts. You'd simply made yourself the only person who remembered that distinction." He tried a different angle, softer, almost pleading. "Ellen and I have built our whole life around this company, Harold. You can't just unilaterally restructure things because you're upset about a taxi." "This isn't about a taxi," I said, and I meant it. Though I understood why he wanted it to be about something that small, something he could dismiss as an old man's wounded feelings rather than a structural correction 3 years in the making. "This is about the fact that if I'd had a stroke on that operating table, you would have run this company as though I never existed. While I remained on paper the majority owner of a business I could no longer actually access. I'm not punishing you for a text message, Peter. I'm correcting something I should have corrected a year ago, and the text message simply told me the correction couldn't wait any longer." Ellen came to see me 2 days later, alone, without Peter, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, where she'd done homework as a girl 30 years earlier. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She told me she hadn't known about the operational restructuring, the vendor contracts, the client relationships, any of it. She'd trusted Peter's account of his own role in the business the same uncritical way I once had, before I'd started looking closely enough to see the pattern underneath his explanations. What she did know, and what she finally said out loud for the first time, was that she'd stopped responding to that group chat message not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of frozen guilt. She'd seen Peter's callous reply land, felt sick about it, and then simply hadn't known how to say anything at all without it becoming a referendum on her entire marriage. I told her I understood that particular kind of paralysis better than she might expect. I also told her, gently but honestly, that silence in a moment like that isn't neutral, even when it doesn't feel like a choice. She cried. I didn't try to talk her out of it. Some conversations don't need fixing in the moment. They just need to be survived honestly. We didn't resolve everything in that one conversation, and I don't think stories like this resolve as cleanly as we'd like them to. But something shifted. Ellen began, slowly, showing up differently, asking harder questions about the business, no longer simply deferring to Peter's version of events, rebuilding piece by piece. The version of herself I remembered from before her marriage had quietly reshaped her into someone smaller. Peter stayed with the company for another 4 months, though the balance of power had permanently shifted. Without the unilateral authority he'd spent 3 years accumulating, his day-to-day value to the business became, frankly, closer to what his original 15% had always reflected. Competent, useful, but no longer indispensable. No longer the sole gatekeeper to relationships that had, in truth, never been his to gatekeep. He resigned eventually, on his own terms, taking a director role at a competing firm, a decent landing. And I want to be clear that I never tried to destroy the man professionally. I only ever wanted to make sure that destroying me, structurally, was no longer an option available to him. There's a meaningful difference between protecting yourself and seeking revenge. And I've tried, throughout this whole ordeal, to stay firmly on the correct side of that line. Ellen and Peter's marriage is still finding its footing. I don't know how that chapter ends. And honestly, it's not entirely mine to know. What I do know is that my daughter calls me now, regularly, on her own, without needing an occasion or an excuse. Last month, she showed up at a hospital follow-up appointment I hadn't even mentioned to her. Denise had let it slip, and Ellen simply appeared in the waiting room, coffee in hand. No explanation needed. I still run the company. Slower now, more deliberately, letting a talented new operations director I hired 6 months ago handle the day-to-day grind that used to be mine and, briefly, Peter's. But every major relationship, every significant contract runs back through me, exactly the way it always should have, exactly the way I let it quietly drift away for 3 years before I finally paid attention to where it was going. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's this. You don't need a dramatic confrontation to protect what you've built. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is notice the slow shift happening under your own feet and correct it quietly, structurally, before the moment arrives when someone assumes you're too weak or too distracted to notice at all. Peter told me to take a cab. He had no idea that by the time that cab pulled up to my house, the ground he'd spent 3 years quietly building underneath himself had already shifted permanently back to where it always should have stood. If this story hit home for you, you're not alone. And there are more like it every week. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to quietly protect something you built before someone else realized what you were doing? I read every single one.